She always woke before the sun, not because she was disciplined, but because her body had learned to anticipate the weight of the day before it even began. Mornings felt like a negotiation between who she used to be and the woman she had become after years of shrinking herself to fit expectations. In the muted light of her apartment, she moved quietly, as if trying not to disturb the memories lodged in the corners of each room. Her daughter was still asleep, curled into the freedom of 18, untouched by the heaviness that clung to her mother like a second skin. The coffee machine hissed to life, and she leaned against the counter, letting the aroma rise. There were days she didn't recognize herself, days when the mirror showed a version of her shaped more by endurance than dreams. She had learned to carry herself with composure, especially after the divorce, when criticism had become a language spoken fluently around her. Too old, too tired, too emotional, too much and not enough in all the wrong ways. She absorbed it quietly until her silence became a habit she no longer questioned. Her office was a world where she functioned well enough, delivering results, smoothing crises, and navigating personalities that demanded more than they ever gave. It was also where she first noticed him, not through a sudden spark or a cinematic moment, but through the steady presence he carried like a soft equilibrium in turbulent rooms. He was younger, unmistakably, but carried an attentiveness that disarmed people without them noticing. She had watched him in meetings, listening with a quiet focus rare in someone his age. He never rushed to speak, never tried to impress. He existed in a way that asked nothing and offered grounding. Their interactions began the way most do: brief exchanges in hallways, polite acknowledgments, professional courtesy. But there was something in the way he looked at her, not elevated or lowered by her age, not shaped by the common assumptions people projected onto women like her. His gaze was level, steady, and free from the invisible measuring tape others used. She didn't know when it began to matter, only that it did. She often stayed late, lingering over projects because the alternative was returning to a home too quiet for someone who had spent years filling silence with responsibility. Sometimes he stayed too, working on something with calm dedication. On those evenings, the office felt different, lighter, somehow gentler. They exchanged short conversations, nothing personal, nothing dangerous. Yet, under the surface, something subtle unfolded, like sunlight creeping slowly across a room. Her daughter, Marina, was the pulse of her life, the one thing that made her believe she had not failed entirely. Watching her grow, fierce and hopeful, brought her pride, and also a strange ache. Marina's youth made her confront her own aging in ways she didn't always know how to articulate. She tried to hide her insecurities, but motherhood had a way of exposing truths, even when unspoken. With the approach of Marina's 18th birthday, memories resurfaced. Birthdays marked by her former husband's criticisms disguised as jokes. Relatives who believed aging was something to mock rather than honor. She had survived all of it, but remnants remained, shaping the way she anticipated family gatherings, with controlled breath, with a faint dread, with the knowledge that someone would eventually say something about her appearance, her age, her choices. The thought of the young coworker drifted in and out of her mind more often than she admitted. Not romantically, she told herself, just a presence she appreciated, a calm she hadn't known she needed. There was comfort in knowing someone in her daily life saw her without the distortions of judgment. She didn't ask for more. She didn't imagine more. Women her age weren't encouraged to imagine much at all. Yet, on one ordinary afternoon, as she was organizing documents before leaving the office, he approached her desk with a question about a report. The conversation was brief, but something in the warmth of his voice lingered even after he walked away. She felt an unfamiliar stirring, something fragile, almost hopeful, followed immediately by the instinct to suppress it. Age difference. The whisper that always hovered. The rule she believed the world had written for women like her. You may grow older, but do not dare to be seen wanting anything beyond your assigned place. She shook the thought away. Life had taught her to expect little and endure much. But something was shifting, quietly, without her consent. And though she didn't know it yet, the upcoming birthday, the dinner, the glances, the words waiting to be spoken. Everything was inching toward a night that would break something open inside her. Not destructively, but necessarily. It began with the way he saw her. Steady, unhurried, without the flicker of discomfort most people exhibited when faced with a woman who had lived more years than they believed she should to be worthy of attention. In the office, where everything was transactional and often superficial, he carried a kind of presence that softened the edges of the day. She noticed it in small moments. The patience he showed when others were rushed, the way he truly listened when she spoke, the absence of judgment in his expression when she explained something complex, or when she admitted exhaustion. He never looked away, not out of insistence or boldness, but because he genuinely didn't see her as the world taught her to expect, lesser, past her prime, irrelevant. His gaze was level, human, grounded. She didn't know how to receive it at first. A lifetime of shrinking made even simple respect feel like a foreign language. Their conversations remained professional, but each carried a quiet undertone, a mutual awareness, not romantic, not intentional, just two lives brushing against each other with an ease she hadn't felt in years. During coffee breaks, when the office hummed with deadlines, he would ask how her day was going, not out of politeness but curiosity. She answered carefully at first, offering fragments instead of truth, but he absorbed even those fragments as if they mattered. On rainy afternoons, when the windows blurred and work piled up, he would stop by her desk to check if she needed help with spreadsheets or logistics. She refused most of the time, uninterested in becoming dependent, but his offers were never patronizing. He never implied she needed assistance because of age, as others had done. He offered help because he was attentive, because that was who he was. And slowly, without planning it, she began to anticipate his presence. Not in the dangerous sense of desire, but in the gentler language of comfort, a steadying force, a reminder that she wasn't invisible. Yet invisibility was something she knew too well. Her marriage had taught her that. Her former husband excelled at noticing every flaw, every wrinkle, every pound gained, every sign of aging, and he weaponized these observations under the guise of humor. She had learned to laugh along, even when the jokes left bruises where no one else could see them. Over the years, she internalized the idea that growing older was a decline, that her worth had an expiration date, that youth belonged to others. Now, each time the young man looked at her without discomfort, something inside her cracked, not painfully, but like a door easing open after years of rust. She remembered one evening when she stayed late to finish an urgent report. The office was nearly empty, the sky outside painted with the last light of dusk. He passed by her desk, noticed the tension in her posture, and without interrupting, placed a cup of tea beside her. No words, no expectation, just a gesture, a human gesture. She had forgotten how deeply such simplicity could reach. It was shortly after that evening that Marina's birthday became a topic of conversation at home. 18, a milestone, a threshold between adolescence and adulthood. Her daughter was excited, buzzing with ideas for the celebration, while she felt the familiar weight of family gatherings settling on her shoulders. Birthdays had never been gentle moments for her. They were opportunities for relatives to highlight how much she had aged, to make jokes about finding new wrinkles, to compare her to younger women in ways meant to amuse but always cut deep. She hid her dread behind a practiced smile. At work, while discussing schedules, the young man casually asked if she had plans for the weekend. She mentioned Marina's upcoming dinner without thinking, focusing on the logistics rather than the emotional minefield it represented. He smiled softly, genuinely happy for her. She didn't expect him to show further interest. He wasn't part of her personal life, and she had no intention of mixing worlds. But that evening, something unexpected happened. As she gathered her things to leave, she felt the urge to linger near his desk. Not to invite him, not to open doors she wasn't allowed to open, but simply to share something that had been silent for too long. She mentioned, with a faint laugh, how birthdays in her family often came with unsolicited commentary about her age. He didn't laugh. He didn't joke. He looked at her in a way that made the air in the room shift. A steady, grounded look that said he understood more than she had revealed. His voice was low, calm. when he replied that people often targeted what they didn't understand or appreciate. It wasn't profound, but it was sincere, and sincerity has a way of landing where grand speeches cannot. She left the office feeling strangely lighter, as if someone had gently lifted the corner of a burden she had carried alone for years. She didn't know it yet, but the seed of what would happen at her daughter's birthday was planted in that moment, not through romance, not through intention, but through the quiet recognition from a younger man who simply saw her fully, and didn't look away. She always felt the shift in her body when a family event approached, as if some quiet alarm inside her prepared for impact. Marina's birthday was only days away, and what should have been a celebration carried the familiar shadow of memories she wished she could forget. Birthdays had never been gentle, not during her marriage, not even after. They were stages on which other people felt free to perform opinions about her life, her age, her appearance. She had learned to brace herself long before anyone spoke. She remembered the early years of her marriage, when she still believed that love softened cruelty. Her ex-husband used to turn every gathering into a comedy show, with her as the punchline. He joked about how she aged too fast, how she should thank good lighting, how she was already older on the inside, even when she was barely in her 30s. Laughter echoed around her then, not hers, but the laughter of others, loud and unbothered. She taught herself to smile through it because she thought that was what strong women did. She didn't know back then that strength was not another word for endurance. The years passed, and the jokes sharpened. During Marina's birthdays, her ex would comment on how the daughter resembled her father's side, thankfully, as if inheriting anything from the mother would have been a misfortune. Family members echoed his attitude, making age a subject of constant humor. She learned to disappear inside her own body, to shrink her presence so the spotlight would move away. But spotlights have a cruel way of returning. Now, with Marina turning 18, the past resurfaced. She had changed, yes. She was older, more cautious, more fragile in certain places, yet also stronger in ways she hadn't recognized until recently. Still, the anticipation of another round of comments stirred something uneasy inside her. She told herself she would endure just as she always had. But a part of her, the part slowly awakening because of the quiet gentleness of a younger man at work, wondered if she deserved more than endurance. The moment that led to inviting him happened in a way she couldn't fully explain. It was late afternoon at the office, the kind of day where time stretched endlessly and thoughts drifted without permission. She had been organizing notes for a presentation when he stopped by her desk. He asked if she needed help carrying documents to another floor. She declined, but he remained for a moment looking at her with that calm, unjudging patience that had become strangely familiar. She made a small joke, one of those half-truths disguised as humor, about how family gatherings always highlighted her age. He didn't respond with laughter. He didn't dismiss it or shrug it off. He simply regarded her with a quiet seriousness, the kind that made her feel seen rather than exposed. "You shouldn't have to sit through that," he had said softly. The sentence lingered long after he returned to his desk. That night, while preparing dinner at home, she thought about his words. She wondered how many years had passed since someone acknowledged her discomfort instead of contributing to it. It felt like stepping into an unfamiliar room, one where she didn't have to be the brunt of a joke to be tolerated. The thought was unsettling, but warm, like remembering a version of herself she had nearly forgotten. The invitation happened almost accidentally. The next day, they found themselves walking toward the elevator at the same time. She mentioned Marina's birthday, partly because it was on her mind, partly because speaking to him brought a sense of ease she couldn't fully define. He asked a simple question, when it would be, and she answered without hesitation. The elevator doors opened. People moved around them, and somewhere between the second and third floor she heard herself inviting him. A small, tentative invitation, not intimate, not suggestive, just a gentle offering, as natural as breathing. He accepted with a quiet nod, no hesitation, no awkwardness, as if her words were the most normal thing in the world. But when the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors closed behind him, she felt the echo of what she had done. Her chest tightened, Would her family misinterpret his presence? Would they judge her even more harshly? Would Marina be uncomfortable? She questioned herself for hours that evening, replaying the moment in her mind until it lost the clarity it had in the elevator. Yet beneath the anxiety was something else, something fragile and glowing. Not hope for romance, not something inappropriate, but the simple reassurance that someone who treated her with respect would be there. Someone who didn't see her as a caricature of aging. Someone who didn't laugh when she mentioned pain. Later that night, while folding laundry, she realized something quietly profound. She didn't invite him because she wanted to impress her family or prove anything. She invited him because she wanted just once to sit at a table where at least one person looked at her without scrutiny. Just once, she wanted to feel safe. And she didn't know it yet. But the safety she longed for would become visible in a way no one at that birthday dinner could anticipate. At breakfast the next morning, the sunlight spilled across the kitchen tiles in a soft, forgiving glow. Marina sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, her hair gathered in a loose braid that made her look even younger. Her mother watched her for a moment before speaking, trying to summon the courage she once had when conversations didn't feel like tightropes. "I invited someone from work to your dinner," she said, keeping her tone casual, controlled. Marina lifted her eyes, curious rather than alarmed. "Who?" She hesitated. Saying his name out loud made the reality of the invitation settle more heavily. "Daniel," she replied softly. "He's a colleague." The pause that followed wasn't disapproval. It wasn't shock. It was something gentler, a mixture of surprise and careful observation. Marina had always been perceptive, reading emotional landscapes the way other people read instructions. Her gaze lingered on her mother's face, searching quietly, respectfully. "Is he nice?" Marina asked finally. The simplicity of the question struck her. Nice. Not young, not inappropriate, not questionable. Just nice. She nodded slowly, grateful for the neutrality. "Yes, he's kind. Very kind." Marina smiled, a small, knowing smile that made her mother feel both exposed and understood. "Then it's fine. It's your dinner too." The relief was immediate, but fleeting. Acceptance from her daughter mattered deeply, yet the broader circle, the extended family, was a different world entirely. A world governed by unspoken rules about aging, appropriateness, and what women were allowed to do once they reached a certain stage of life. In that world, kindness was irrelevant, and judgment came quickly. Throughout the day, she sent messages confirming details for the restaurant. As expected, rumors traveled faster than facts. Her sister replied with a teasing question about the mystery guest. Her aunt sent a voice note filled with poorly disguised amusement. Her mother simply wrote, "Are you sure about that?" She had lived long enough to understand what those words really meant. By lunchtime, the whispers had already formed a narrative. A younger man was coming to the dinner. A colleague. Someone new. And because people love filling silence with assumptions, the age difference became the centerpiece of every speculation. She knew exactly what they were thinking. She had seen those reactions before. Raised eyebrows, smirks exchanged behind napkins, jokes that pretended to be harmless but always left wounds. She pushed through the rest of her workday with a tightness in her chest. Even the sound of her phone buzzing made her flinch slightly. She avoided reading some of the messages until hours later, when Daniel passed by her desk. His presence steadied her. He asked nothing about the dinner, didn't pry, didn't interpret her tension as an invitation to tease. He simply placed a stack of printed documents on her desk, murmured that he had taken care of the corrections she needed, and walked back to his seat. His calmness grounded her more than she expected. When she finally left the office, her legs felt heavier than usual. On the drive home, she tried to convince herself she was overreacting. That age difference wasn't a crime, that inviting a colleague wasn't an act of rebellion. And yet, the voice in her head, the one shaped by years of criticism, insisted otherwise. Later that night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection with a kind of quiet interrogation. Lines around her eyes, a softness around her jaw, shadows of sleepless nights. She wasn't ashamed of aging, not exactly. She was ashamed of how people made her feel about it, as if living longer was an inconvenience to others. She wondered what Daniel saw when he looked at her. Not romantically, she refused to let her mind wander there, but simply as a person. Did he notice the lines? Did he notice the years? Or did he see the things she tried to hide? The exhaustion, the resilience, the quietness she carried because life had taught her to fear taking up too much space? She placed both hands on the sink and let out a slow breath. The dinner was happening whether she felt ready or not. Her daughter supported her. That should have been enough. But the next day, when she told her ex-husband about the dinner plans, only because he needed to know the time and place, she received the reaction she had feared. He laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but with that subtle, dismissive chuckle that had once shaped her self-worth. "Are you bringing a colleague? Interesting," he said. "I hope he knows what he's getting himself into." The words clung to her skin like cold air. She didn't respond. Silence had become her shield, even when silence hurt. By the time the birthday dinner approached, everyone knew Daniel would be there. Some pretended not to be curious. Others simply didn't pretend. She could feel their questions waiting, their interpretations lined up like knives made of polite phrasing. But beneath the anxiety was something else, something unexpected, a quiet thread of defiance, because for the first time in years, she wasn't walking into a family gathering alone. Someone would sit beside her who didn't see her age as a weakness, someone who didn't turn her into a joke, someone who treated her with a respect she had rarely been offered. And even if her family misinterpreted it, even if the whispers multiplied, she knew one truth. She had invited him not because of how others saw her, but because of how he made her feel. Seen, heard, and no longer invisible. The morning of the dinner arrived with a quiet tension that settled into her chest before she even opened her eyes. The apartment was still, touched by the soft light drifting through the curtains, but her thoughts moved with a restless rhythm she couldn't quite calm. Marina had already left for a study session, leaving a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that read simply, "Everything will be all right, Mom." Those words lingered more deeply than the ink itself. They carried reassurance, but also awareness. Her daughter knew her fears better than anyone. For most of her adult life, preparing for an event meant choosing clothes that hid more than they revealed. Dresses that softened her figure, fabrics that didn't draw attention, colors that blended into the background. She had mastered the art of invisibility, but that day felt different. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, least of all Daniel, but because she wanted to reclaim something she had slowly given away over the years, the permission to feel beautiful without apology. She opened her wardrobe and studied the choices as though they were pages of a story she hadn't finished writing. There were practical blouses, office dresses, and a handful of garments she rarely used because they felt too bold for her current life. Her fingers paused on a soft, muted blue dress she had bought months earlier but never worn. It wasn't extravagant or revealing. It simply carried a quiet elegance, flowing fabric, gentle lines, a neckline that framed her collarbones delicately. She had told herself at the time that she would wear it when she felt like herself again. She had never chosen it. Until now. She slipped it on slowly, aware of the weight of the moment. In the mirror, the dress moved with her in a way that felt forgiving. She wasn't transformed. She wasn't suddenly radiant. But she recognized herself in a way she hadn't in years. Not as a woman apologizing for time, but as someone reclaiming space inside her own body. She applied makeup with a light hand. A bit of foundation to even her skin, mascara to open her eyes, a soft shade of lipstick that added warmth without demanding attention. She wasn't preparing to be admired. She was preparing to feel present. As she worked, memories flickered uninvited. Birthdays from years past, where her ex-husband hovered behind her, criticizing her makeup or telling her she looked tired, even when she had spent hours trying to meet his impossible standards. She pushed the memories aside, reminding herself that those voices held no authority anymore. Her phone buzzed with messages from relatives. Most were neutral. Some were thinly veiled provocations disguised as casual curiosity. "Animada para hoje?" one aunt asked. Vai a presentar alguém especial? Her stomach tightened, but she ignored them. She had already given those people more power over her mind than they deserved. As she fastened her earrings, a pair of simple silver drops her daughter had given her last Christmas, she felt a subtle steadiness return. The earrings reminded her that her worth wasn't measured by other people's scrutiny, but by the eyes of those who genuinely loved her. By the time she stepped out of her room, her pulse had steadied, though not entirely. She gathered Marina's wrapped gift from the table, grabbed her purse, and took one last look around the apartment. Everything appeared ordinary, but she knew the evening ahead would shift something inside her, even if only slightly. The taxi ride to the restaurant was quiet. She watched the city pass by, the shoreline glowing in late afternoon light, people walking dogs, couples strolling hand in hand, groups of friends laughing at cafe tables. Life moved effortlessly around her, unaware of the storm she carried inside. She tried to breathe steadily, tried to focus on the intention behind everything she'd prepared, the desire to support her daughter's milestone, to endure her family's presence, to sit across from someone who treated her with dignity. When the taxi arrived at the restaurant, she paused before stepping out. The place was intimate, warm, designed with wooden accents and soft lighting, the kind of environment where voices softened and emotions felt more pronounced. She walked inside, greeted by the host, and was led to the reserved table where Marina and several relatives were already seated. The moment she approached, she felt the subtle shift in the air, eyes landing on her dress, taking inventory, forming silent judgments. She lifted her chin slightly, a small act of courage she hoped no one noticed. Marina stood to hug her, whispering quietly, "Você está linda." Those words landed like a bomb, but beneath that moment of warmth, a quiet anticipation lingered at the edge of the table. Everyone knew Daniel would come. Everyone was waiting. And though she feared the reactions that would follow, a small part of her held on to one truth. She had chosen her dress, her look, her presence not for them, but for herself. She took her seat, adjusted the fabric of her dress, and breathed deeply. This night would test parts of her she had spent years protecting. But she was no longer the woman who hid in the corners of group photos. Not tonight. The restaurant hummed with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Warm light spilled from hanging lamps, creating pockets of intimacy around each table. She sat between Marina and her sister, trying to anchor herself in the glow of the environment, rather than the anticipation that pressed against her ribs. Around her, relatives exchanged greetings and commented on the decor, but beneath their polite chatter, she sensed their curiosity sharpening. She kept her gaze lowered at first, smoothing the cloth napkin on her lap, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, anything to keep her hands occupied. Marina nudged her lightly under the table, offering a reassuring smile that said, "I'm here." She nodded back, grateful for the silent solidarity. The waiters moved gracefully between tables, delivering dishes that filled the room with aromas of roasted herbs, citrus, and freshly baked bread. She tried to focus on these details to ground herself, but every sound seemed amplified. Every laugh, every whispered conversation, every shifting chair. Time felt suspended, stretched thin over the moment she knew was coming. Her sister leaned closer and whispered, "Elle vem mesmo?" The tone was light, but the implication wasn't. She felt heat crawl up her neck but responded with a simple, firm nod. Her sister chuckled softly, not unkindly, but with a hint of amusement that made her chest tighten. She turned her attention back to Marina, who took her hand beneath the table and squeezed it gently. Minutes passed, long, slow minutes that felt like a test of endurance. Her heart raced each time someone entered the restaurant. She found herself glancing toward the entrance more often than she intended, the tension rising with every false alarm. Then the door opened again, and this time it was him. Daniel stepped inside with quiet confidence, wearing a crisp shirt and a calm expression that seemed unchanged by the possibility of awkward introductions or judgmental eyes. He scanned the room briefly before spotting their table. His gaze landed on her, and something subtle shifted. Her breath caught, her anxiety paused, and a faint warmth spread through her chest. He walked toward them with unhurried steps, his posture relaxed, his presence grounding. The table fell into a sudden silence, the kind that stretches out when people try too hard to seem natural. Marina brightened instantly and stood to greet him. Some relatives followed her lead. Others remained seated, observing him with thin layers of curiosity and caution. "Oi, Daniel," Marina said kindly, extending a hand. He shook it with a warm smile before turning to her mother. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. She saw her reflection in his eyes, not older than him, not out of place, not a subject of scrutiny, just herself, seen without distortion. "It's so good that you came," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm glad to be here," he replied, not loudly, not timidly, simply sincere. He took the empty seat beside her, and immediately she felt the shift in the room. Some relatives exchanged glances. An aunt raised her eyebrows. Her ex-mother-in-law, seated at the far end of the table, stared openly before leaning toward the person next to her to whisper something behind her hand. The message was clear, even without words. "He's too young." Her stomach tightened. But then Daniel unfolded his napkin, settled into his chair, and smiled at the group with calm politeness. He seemed unaffected by the silent evaluations surrounding him. That steadiness anchored her more than anything else. As the waiter approached to take drink orders, Daniel asked her quietly whether she preferred water or wine. The question was simple, almost mundane, yet the thoughtfulness behind it sent a small wave of warmth through her. Her relatives watched their interaction closely, dissecting every gesture, every glance. She could feel it, but she refused to flinch. When the drinks arrived, conversation resumed tentatively. Marina chatted with Daniel about her plans for university, and he listened with an attentiveness that seemed to soften the atmosphere a little. Some relatives drifted into the conversation, testing the waters, trying to decide how they should interpret him. But beneath the surface, scrutiny persisted. She felt it every time someone's eyes lingered too long, every time a relative asked a question that felt more like a probe, as if searching for a flaw to justify their discomfort. Yet Daniel remained composed, his responses kind and respectful, his posture relaxed. At one point, her sister dropped a comment about him being bem chovim para rodinhas de familia, said with a forced laugh that didn't quite mask the judgment. She braced herself for embarrassment, but Daniel simply smiled and replied that good company had no age restrictions. The firmness in his tone was gentle, but unmistakable. She felt something shift inside her, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She wasn't used to being defended, even subtly. Not in front of this family. Not by anyone. As plates of food began to arrive, she let herself breathe a little more deeply. Daniel's presence beside her wasn't loud or dominant. It was steady, protective in a way that didn't claim space but created it. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing the room alone. And the night had only just begun. The dinner unfolded with a deceptive smoothness at first, the kind that masks tension rather than dissolves it. Plates clinked, waiters moved in rhythmic patterns, and soft music drifted through the restaurant like a veil. But beneath that polished surface, she felt the undercurrents. Small glances, tiny pauses, sentences sharpened just enough to break skin without leaving visible marks. Daniel sat beside her, calm and observant, unaware of the family choreography she had learned to navigate over decades. He listened politely to conversations, asked Marina about her future plans, and offered small comments that blended seamlessly into the flow of the evening. His presence should have relaxed her, yet the awareness of being watched kept her muscles tightened with quiet restraint. Her aunt, seated 2 chairs down, leaned toward her sister and whispered something hidden behind a napkin. Laughter followed, muted, but not muted enough. She caught fragments of the murmurs drifting through the air. Words like idade, colega, corajam. Even when the whispers weren't fully audible, the intention carried clearly. She felt an old familiar sting behind her sternum, the kind that came not from the words themselves, but from the echo of all the times she had been the subject of such whispered assessments. Across the table, her ex-mother-in-law glanced at Daniel with overt curiosity, then at her, then back at him again. Her lips tightened into a line of disapproval that needed no explanation. People like her didn't hide their judgments. They refined them into silent critiques that pierced more deeply than spoken words. When the waiter placed the first round of dishes on the table, pasta, roasted vegetables, grilled fish, her uncle commented loudly enough for several people to hear, "Bom ver a familia crescendo, de formas inesperadas." The others chuckled politely, the kind of laughter that cracked the moment open. Her stomach tightened. She waited for Daniel to react, but he simply lifted his glass calmly, maintaining his composure. Marina shot her uncle a sharp look, followed by a pointed, "He's a friend of my mother. That's all." Her daughter's voice held a firmness that stunned her. She felt a sudden wave of gratitude, tempered by worry. Marina shouldn't have to defend her. Not here, not tonight. Still, the comments continued, shifting shape but not tone. "He could be your nephew," one cousin murmured to another. "Trabalham juntas?" "Interessante," her aunt added, drawing out the word until it soured. She tried to smile through it, tried to keep her breath steady, but each remark landed like a small blow. She felt herself retreating inward, a habit formed long before she ever imagined inviting someone like Daniel to a family dinner. Her mind drifted to old memories, her ex-husband mocking her laugh lines, comparing her unfavorably to younger women at gatherings. She had survived that, but the remnants of those years clung to her in fragile places. She tried to participate in the conversation, but the strain in her voice betrayed her. Daniel noticed. She felt it in the quiet way he angled his body slightly toward her, in the softening of his expression when he caught the flinches she tried to hide. When the table quieted for a moment, he spoke to her in a low, steady voice meant only for her ears. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." The words were simple, barely more than air, but they broke through her tension like a steady hand reaching into deep water. She inhaled slowly, letting the reassurance settle. No one had said something like that to her in years, certainly not in the presence of those who had learned to make her feel less without ever raising their voices. Desserts were suggested, menus passed around, and the atmosphere momentarily softened as chocolate cakes and fruit tarts were ordered. But as soon as the waiter walked away, another comment cut through the air. "Interesting to see a woman your age with so much social flair," her sister remarked. Her tone dipped in sugar, but carrying unmistakable weight. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel spoke first. "She carries more grace in one evening than most people manage in a lifetime." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge anyone directly, but the effect was immediate. A hush fell over the table. Her relatives froze, surprised by the firmness wrapped inside his calm tone. No one knew how to process it. Praise wasn't the script they expected him to follow. Her breath caught in her chest. A part of her wanted to smile. Another part wanted to hide. She had never been defended so gently, so publicly, without someone turning her into something pitiful. The chatter resumed slowly, shakily, like people trying to pretend they weren't rattled. But something had shifted. She felt it. The scrutiny didn't disappear, but it faltered. Cracks formed in the armor of judgment that had surrounded her for so many years. Dinner continued, plates cleared, candles flickering softly in the low light. But beneath it all, one truth settled into her bones. For the first time in a long time, someone had refused to let her be diminished. And that refusal echoed louder than any whisper at the table. The moment the cake appeared, carried by two waiters through the dim glow of the restaurant, time seemed to shift into a delicate, fragile stillness. Conversation softened, chairs scraped gently against the floor, and a subtle anticipation filled the air. Marina's birthday, her 18th, was a milestone, a celebration meant to center her. And yet, in the space beneath everyone's breath, the dinner had already become something else, a quiet battleground between past wounds and newfound dignity. She watched her daughter's face light up as the candles flickered. Marina's smile radiated with uncomplicated joy, the kind her mother wished she could claim for herself. She tried to anchor her attention there, in her daughter's happiness, but the weight of the evening pressed in from all sides. She felt eyes glancing between her and Daniel, even in the dim light, measuring, interpreting, deciding. The waiters set the cake down, and the table erupted into the familiar wavering chorus of parabens. She clapped along, her voice steady, her smile warm, determined not to let the tension of the night overshadow the moment. Daniel sang too, not loudly, but with a sincerity that made something inside her loosen. As the last notes faded, Marina closed her eyes to make her wish. The glow of the candles illuminated her face in a soft halo, and for a second, the restaurant felt suspended in time. A hush spread around the table, carrying the unspoken hopes a mother always holds for her child: strength, safety, freedom from the insecurities she herself had never fully escaped. When Marina blew out the candles, applause followed. The warmth of the moment spread briefly, like a soft wave. Cameras clicked. Aunts leaned in for photos. Her sister dabbed her eyes sentimentally. For those few seconds, everything felt normal, almost tender. But normalcy never lasted long in her family. As plates were distributed and the first slices of cake passed around, the murmurs began again. Soft, sharp, meant to blend into cheerful chatter, but carrying enough edge to pierce. "That colleague is handsome," someone whispered. "I can only imagine what he sees in her," another muttered. The words drifted toward her like invisible shards. Her throat tightened around a silent ache she couldn't swallow. She focused on cutting her slice of cake, but her hands were unsteady. She felt the familiar urge to disappear, to shrink into the background of the table, to become small enough to avoid being a target. Marina noticed. Her daughter's eyes narrowed, alert and protective. She placed a hand on her mother's arm beneath the table, a grounding touch that steadied her for a moment. But then the next blow came, a cousin leaning forward, smiling too widely, speaking in a tone coated with curiosity, disguised as innocence. "So, Aunt, how did you two meet? At work? Interesting how close you are." There it was, the spotlight, placed directly on her. She froze, her breath caught. She hated this. Being examined, dissected, turned into a spectacle. It felt like the old days, when her ex-husband would make comments about her in front of everyone, pushing her into a corner she couldn't escape. She feared slipping back into that submissive silence she had spent years dismantling. She parted her lips to answer, but her voice faltered before a sound emerged. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. Before she could decide what to say, he leaned forward slightly, still calm, still composed, and spoke in a tone that carried across the table without force. "I approached her first," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering, "because she is the most capable person in our department. I wanted to learn from her." Silence. Complete silence. Her family blinked, taken aback. The honesty of his words cut through the noise of judgment with unexpected clarity. No exaggeration, no defensiveness, just truth spoken plainly, without apology. Her heart stirred painfully. Not from romantic implication, there was none, but from validation she had long been denied. He continued, still looking at the cousin, still calm. "If I'm close to her, it's because she earned my respect long before she knew it." The table shifted. She felt it, an invisible rearranging of the unspoken hierarchies, the quiet shame settling over those who had spent the evening weaponizing her age. Some relatives cleared their throats awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates. A few exchanged glances tinged with discomfort. Daniel didn't look at her as he spoke. He didn't need to. His intention wasn't to perform. It was simply to correct the narrative being built around her. Marina's eyes shimmered with pride. Her mother felt emotion rising in her throat too quickly, too intensely. She swallowed hard, but the lump remained. The next few minutes passed in softened conversation. People seemed suddenly preoccupied with their cake, their forks, their napkins, anything that didn't require meeting her eyes. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was palpable, a recalibration of what they thought they knew. She sat quietly, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the fragile sense of dignity returning to her. The candles had been blown out moments earlier, but it was in this precise instant, amid the silence, the softened glances, the humbled faces, that a different kind of light filled her chest. A light she hadn't felt in years. A light born not from being rescued, but from being finally respected. The atmosphere shifted the moment the cake plates were pushed aside and conversation lulled into an expectant quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't happen naturally, one born from scrutiny, from anticipation, from a collective curiosity that hovered like invisible smoke above the table. She felt it immediately, the same way she once sensed storms forming long before clouds appeared. Her pulse quickened. She straightened slightly, preparing for whatever would come next. Marina leaned back in her chair, laughing softly at a message on her phone. Her youth seemed to glow in that moment, untouched by the cynicism that clung to the adults around her. The relatives watched her, saw her smile, and then inevitably shifted their eyes back to her mother, as if waiting for another opportunity to dissect her choices. But then Daniel moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in his posture, a deliberate inhale, the calm setting of his hands on the table. She felt it before she understood it. Something changed in the air, quiet but unmistakable, like the silence before a melody begins. He cleared his throat gently. The sound was soft, but the entire table turned toward him as though pulled by an unseen thread. "I'd like to say something," he said, voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to cross the length of the table without strain. Her heart froze. Her breath lodged somewhere between ribs and throat. His eyes weren't on her family. They were on Marina. "I know tonight is about you," he began, addressing her daughter with calm sincerity. "And I want to acknowledge how much your mother talks about you at work, not in the way people gossip or compare, but with pride, with genuine admiration." Marina's expression softened, touched by the unexpected compliment. He continued, "It's rare to find someone who speaks of their child with such respect. She never takes credit for your accomplishments. She just celebrates them." Around the table, relatives exchanged puzzled glances. They hadn't expected him to speak at all, much less begin this way. But his words didn't linger on Marina. Soon, inevitably, they turned toward her. "And I also want to say something about her," he added, letting his gaze move to the woman beside him. Warm, steady, unshaken by the attention now fixed on him. Her stomach tightened. She wanted to stop him, to protect him from their judgment, or to protect herself from whatever this attention would unleash. But she couldn't move. She was anchored by the certainty in his eyes. "She is someone I deeply respect," he said, his tone unhurried, every word deliberate. "Not because she tries to be perfect, not because she hides who she is, but because she is consistent, honest, and stronger than most people realize." Her lips parted in a small, involuntary breath. The room seemed to contract around his voice, drawing every ear toward him. "In our department," he continued, "there are days when everything feels like it's falling apart. Deadlines, demands, people losing their patience. But she—" He paused, not for effect, but to choose his words with precision. "She never crumbles. She never blames. She holds the entire structure together." Someone at the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Her sister's fork clinked against her plate. Her aunt pressed a napkin to her lips, eyes darting between the two of them. He wasn't done. "She doesn't ask for recognition, but she deserves it," he said simply. Silence rippled through the table, thick, weighted, undeniable. She felt her throat tighten again. But this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from the unfamiliar sensation of being honored. Daniel wasn't grandiose. He didn't exaggerate. He wasn't performing for applause. His tone remained level, grounded, as if stating obvious facts no one else had bothered to see. He rested his hands lightly on the table, concluding with a softness that broke something open inside her. "I wanted to say that tonight, because people like her often go unseen, and she shouldn't be." He said nothing else. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't check reactions. He simply leaned back in his chair and allowed the silence to settle. And settle it did. Her family stared at her, not with the usual dismissive amusement, but with something new, something raw. For the first time, their eyes reflected uncertainty, not about Daniel, but about themselves, about the things they had said over the years, about the moments they had laughed at her expense, about the assumptions they had made. Daniel had not defended her with noise or confrontation. He had defended her with truth. And that truth hung in the air like a gentle but undeniable shift in gravity. She blinked, trying to steady the surge of emotion rising inside her. She felt her daughter's hand cover hers beneath the table, warm, steady, full of quiet pride. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. And that feeling alone was enough to make her chest ache. The silence after Daniel's words didn't dissipate quickly. It lingered with a strange, trembling weight, as though the whole table struggled to navigate a sudden shift in the emotional temperature. She felt suspended in that silence, caught between disbelief and the overwhelming need to breathe, to steady herself, to keep her composure from unraveling in front of everyone. Her heartbeat pulsed unevenly. She could feel it in her neck, in her fingertips, in the fragile place just beneath her ribs. Her eyes burned before she even realized tears were forming. Marina was the first to move. She squeezed her mother's hand beneath the table with a pressure that said, "I saw everything. I understand." It was enough to loosen the breath she'd been holding. Still, she tried to swallow the emotion rising in her throat. She had spent years mastering the art of emotional containment. She knew how to tuck pain into invisible corners. She knew how to smile through humiliation. She knew how to retreat behind practiced composure. But this wasn't pain. It wasn't humiliation. It was the opposite, and that made it even harder to control. She blinked once, twice, a third time. Then the tears came. Not dramatically, not loudly, just softly, two quiet streams slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. She lifted her hand to wipe them away but found it trembling. Her sister noticed first, startled into silence. Her aunt straightened in her chair. Her ex-mother-in-law tensed, lips pressing together as if regretting every whisper she'd spoken since the evening began. Her ex-husband stared, not with empathy, but with confusion, because he had never seen her cry for something good. She lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the sudden vulnerability. But then she felt Daniel's presence beside her. Not through touch, not through words, but through the quiet steadiness radiating from him. It gave her enough courage to inhale without breaking. Marina leaned closer. "Mom, are you okay?" she whispered. She nodded, though her voice wouldn't obey her yet. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want the moment to become about her losing control. But the emotion was too vast, too long denied, too deeply needed. In front of her, Daniel remained composed, giving her space without drawing attention. His eyes caught hers for a brief moment, just long enough to anchor her again. His expression held no embarrassment, no pity, only understanding. She breathed shakily, placing her napkin gently against her cheeks. She whispered, almost to herself, "Disculpa," but Marina shook her head firmly. "Don't apologize." Something in that small sentence broke another layer inside her, the layer built from decades of apologizing for existing imperfectly. Around the table, relatives shifted in uneasy silence. The tone of the evening had transformed. No one dared whisper now. No one dared smirk. The walls they built from judgment had cracked, and the quiet that followed felt like an admission they were too proud to speak aloud. Her sister cleared her throat, trying to relive the moment. What he said was, "Very nice," she murmured, softer than usual. Her aunt nodded, eyes lowered. It's rare to hear someone speak like that, with such truth. Even her ex-mother-in-law gave a curt nod, as though acknowledging something she couldn't quite articulate. The tension in her chest loosened slowly, like a knot finally beginning to release after years of tightness. She didn't stop crying immediately. The tears came in small waves, each one a release of something old, something heavy. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a whisper. "Obrigada," she said, looking at Daniel though her vision blurred. He only smiled gently, an acknowledgement that needed no words. The rest of the dinner unfolded with a softness she hadn't expected. Conversations shifted to lighter topics. People spoke with a new restraint, as though aware of the line they had crossed earlier. Marina stayed close to her, beaming in ways that made her mother's heart swell. She didn't speak much during the remainder of the evening. She didn't need to. Her silence was different now. Not the silence of being diminished, but the silence of having finally been lifted. By the time the checks were settled and relatives gathered their belongings, she felt strangely lighter. Fragile, yes, but in a way that made room for something healing rather than something breaking. As they walked toward the exit, Marina looped her arm around her mother's. "You deserved every word he said," she whispered. Her chest tightened again, but this time with gratitude. Outside the restaurant, the night air was cool, brushing against her skin like a quiet blessing. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment settle. For the first time in years, she felt a layer of shame dissolve. A layer she had carried so long she had forgotten what life felt like without it. No one had ever spoken for her that way. No one had ever seen her that way. And the tears that kept returning were not from pain. They were from recognition. When the restaurant doors closed behind them, the night seemed quieter than it had any right to be. The city moved in its usual rhythm. Cars passing, distant conversations drifting through the air. But around her, a stillness formed, tender and unfamiliar. She stood for a moment beneath the soft glow of the entrance lights, breathing in the cool air as if learning how to breathe again. Marina hugged her tightly before leaving with a friend, whispering, "Te amo, Mai," in a way that carried understanding rather than obligation. Her daughter walked away with a lightness that made her heart ache, because for the first time, she felt Marina truly saw her not as a mother struggling to endure, but as a woman deserving of gentleness. When she and Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, of everything left unspoken, of everything already understood. He didn't rush to fill it. He simply stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the lights reflect softly on the pavement. "You did well tonight," he said eventually, his voice steady and warm. She let out a breath that trembled slightly. "I didn't feel like I did." "You did," he replied softly. "You stayed true to yourself, and you let yourself be seen." She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the truth of his words settle into the cracks inside her. The tears that had threatened earlier began to stir again, not with the same force, but with a quiet ache that felt cleansing. They began walking slowly toward the curb where her taxi would arrive. The night carried the faint scent of the ocean, a reminder of the coastline stretching just a few streets away. She found comfort in the rhythm of their steps, his calm pace matching hers without effort, without expectation. "I wasn't prepared for what you said back there," she admitted carefully, her voice a fragile thread in the air. He paused, turning to face her fully. The streetlight cast a soft glow over his features, illuminating the sincerity in his eyes. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true." She shook her head gently. "You didn't have to defend me. I didn't defend you." His tone remained soft, but firm. "I just told the truth people should have seen for themselves." Her breath unsteady, she looked toward the darkened restaurant windows, now reflecting only the street behind them. She thought of the years she spent folding into herself, minimizing every part that might offend or disappoint someone. She thought of the jokes she endured, the silences she swallowed, the small wounds that piled into something heavy enough to reshape her posture. She had walked into that dinner expecting to feel diminished again. Instead, she walked out feeling seen. "Thank you," she whispered, not out of obligation, but because gratitude rose too strongly to contain. He nodded once, accepting her words without brushing them aside, without diminishing their weight. He understood how much it cost her to say them. The taxi arrived, headlights sweeping gently across the sidewalk. She turned toward him, uncertain of what to do next. Their connection wasn't defined by romance, nor by expectation. It existed in the quiet spaces, respect, recognition, and the shared understanding that age didn't dictate worth. As she opened the door, he spoke again, his tone steady but soft. "You don't have to shrink anymore." The words hit her with surprising force. She felt something loosen inside, a rope that had been pulled tight for years finally slackening. She met his gaze, letting the truth of his words settle deeply. "I'll try," she murmured. "You already started tonight," he replied. She stepped into the taxi, and the driver asked for her address. Before she answered, she looked back at Daniel one last time. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, calm and steady in the glow of the street lamp. Not a savior, not a symbol, just a man who had offered her something rare and essential, validation without conditions. As the taxi pulled away, she leaned her head against the window, watching him fade gradually into the distance. Not disappearing, just becoming part of the city's quiet landscape, a presence that lingered even when out of sight. Her thoughts drifted as the city lights blurred outside the window. She replayed the evening piece by piece, the comments, the tension, the unexpected defense, the tears she could no longer hide. And somewhere between those memories, a realization rose gently. The night had not been about proving anything. Not to her family, not to Daniel, not even to herself. It had been about reclaiming something she had forgotten, her right to exist fully, without apology. When she reached home, she paused before entering, feeling the weight of her own heartbeat. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and let the quiet envelop her. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt like possibility. For the first time in a long time, she believed that the future didn't require her to vanish into the background. It didn't require her to justify her worth. It didn't require her to be less. She walked to her bedroom, removed her earrings, placed them gently on the dresser, and caught her reflection in the mirror. She didn't see age. She didn't see exhaustion. She saw a woman who had survived quietly, and who, at least for one night, had been seen loudly. A woman who no longer felt invisible, and as she turned off the light, she allowed herself the rare, tender luxury of hope.